Utah Stories. So today on the program, we are talking to somebody who was brave enough to come on the program, talk about their homeless situation, how they were previously homeless, and what it was like to live on the streets. I want to say beforehand, if you like our content, please give this episode a thumbs up and go subscribe to our channel on YouTube and consider subscribing to our free digital newsletter. And without further ado, Shiv Parihar.
Yeah.
Thanks for being on.
Thank you.
So just describe for me what the situation is currently like at around downtown. You said 2nd South and First
South and 30th is where we live now, but really the whole downtown area where we're supposed to be seeing our renewal as a city after COVID is an indictment of everyone who's been in leadership for the past 10 years. So I was homeless from 2013 to 2015, and there was a better homelessness infrastructure system then than there is now. I regularly walk by people sleeping under snowbanks, sleeping in piles of their own filth, and this is a situation the city has the power to control and has demonstrated that it has the power to control, but is actively refusing to do so.
How are they actively refusing? I mean, I know what, but explain for our listening audience how they're refusing to do so.
You see the road home, which was really the hub for all this, but also a place for shelter, was closed down. And with that, the entire city became the victims of the homeless crisis. Meanwhile, the homeless population who needed resources have been actively denied. It's a hands-off policy that's bad for everyone. People who are in business, people who are trying to help renew downtown are finding themselves on the receiving end of crime, on the receiving end of the problems that necessarily come in public health when you have encampments on the streets. Well, at the same time, our homeless population has been robbed of their basic human dignity. There are not public restrooms available across downtown. This is a public health issue that would be easily fixed if we had something as simple as porta potties available across downtown, across really any of the areas near a homeless resource center, such as the one in Ballpark, Galen Miller.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. When I first started covering the homeless situation 3 years ago, we've always been covering news from the perspective of small business owners, and they were showing up on Main Street businesses with a pile of defecation right in the fronts of their sidewalks. And then, of course, perhaps the natural reaction is, oh, these crazy, dirty homeless people just pooping out in the middle of the sidewalk. But of course, how is that their fault if the city's locking up all the public restrooms, if there's no porta potties, there's no place for them to go? I mean, where are you supposed to go? There's just no place for them to defecate, especially if all the resource centers are full.
Absolutely. When it comes right down to it, each and every one of the public health issues we're facing that the city is trying to pin on the homeless population is the city's fault and the county's fault. Mayor Mendenhall and Mayor Wilson are completely abandoning their call to duty and the oath of offices that they took in their handling of the homelessness crisis. Yeah.
And so you were homeless for how long did you say?
2 years on and off.
Yeah.
And then an earlier period that was also a little bit on and off. But
and a lot of people, unfortunately, when we post our reels on Instagram, they have this sort of idea that if you're homeless, it must be your own fault. So how was it your fault, Chief?
I mean, well, it wasn't. It was,
of course,
it was partially economic. It was after the 2008 recession. And then, of course, there were also other factors going in. There was, separation of my parents, things like that. I was a child at that point, so it wasn't my fault at all. I mean, I was with a parent, and it still shocks me, though, that there were more resources then than there are now.
Yeah.
I slept on the side of I-80 on a piece of cardboard in a sleeping bag. A night as cold as 5 degrees. But when there was snow, I would have the opportunity to go to the road home, to go to the overflow shelters. Those don't exist anymore. There are not shelter beds available. It's a crime against an entire segment of the population, and that segment of the population that city government and county government and state government and Mayor Mendenhall keeps bringing every level of government into this. And all she's doing is further proving the extent to which our residents are being abandoned.
And so she just won re-election, and I think it was a combination of factors that led to her victory. One factor I can see clearly is that Rocky Anderson, her main opponent, was deemed to be running a highly negative campaign. But how do you talk about the situation we're in right now with the homeless population without going negative? I mean, there's just nothing good to say about any of it.
It's difficult. I worked with Rocky very heavily, and it was a strange situation where so many people were complaining about the negativity, but those same people would complain about the state of the city. And they just didn't want to hear about it constantly. But when you're running, I mean, just generally when you're running against an incumbent, you have to go after the situation. But when the situation is this blatantly terrible, that our downtown is infested with camps and filled with people who deserve resources that are not being given to them, it's horrific. And it frankly does come down to a dereliction of duty on behalf of every member of Salt Lake City government tasked with handling the homelessness crisis, and all the way up to the top of the chain with Wayne Niederhauser.
And then, and exactly. You cannot look at that situation without describing it exactly how you described it. A dereliction of duty, because you have an empty, shuttered Ramada Inn that could house right now 440 people. It's empty. It's abandoned. Nobody can go inside of it. That was supposed to be set aside for the homeless. Mendenhall spearheaded the effort to, find the developer who was going to remodel that facility and provide studio housing for the people who were in, on the streets.
And their license expired. That developer, the city didn't announce it, had an expired license. This project was dead in the water, and the city didn't go through with it. A similar situation. So across the street from the Methodist church that hosts the movie nights where folks are able to get together, and homeless folks specifically are able to spend the night when there are not shelters available and it's snowing and we're in a Code Blue style situation. Across the street from there is the Salt Lake City former public safety building. It's now abandoned to where the police department used to be. And I've seen people sleeping in snowbanks outside of that building that is empty and sitting abandoned with a fence around it.
Yeah.
And right now the city is spending millions of dollars, over $1 million, on this pod proposal, which at a cost of $50,000 per person is going to be housing 50 people. For that amount of money, you could get all of those people vouchers, or you could do a pods proposal on a much cheaper model and house in that pod model every homeless person in the county.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like they absolutely don't want to find or use any of the solutions that are out there. And the other dereliction is they never even open the sanctioned campground for the pods.
Absolutely.
And that's absolutely, I've tried to call Wayne Niederhauser's office. I've tried to get an explanation of why he could not find an operator, because there's plenty of good operators that I could find. I mean, I've talked to them.
Wendy Garvin?
Yeah, Wendy Garvin would be the most, or have Wendy Garvin if perhaps she needs a little more experience on, I don't know, management of facilities, partner with the In-Between, who runs an excellent facility, or the other side of Village Academy. They could have found a solution, is my point. They didn't want to find a solution. They just said, we can't find an operator. And so those pods that could be keeping people warm and out of the cold are just collecting snow and just sitting there. And it's just unbelievable to me.
At the mayoral debate, actually, at the Other Side Academy, I went up and I asked Mayor Mendenhall in front of the crowd when the last time was that she visited a homeless encampment, and she couldn't give me an answer. And you saw Rocky Anderson go out there regularly visiting these homeless encampments. And, that's frankly the minimum I'd ask for from Mayor Mendenhall. That if you're going to take these people, if you're going to tear down their tents, if you're going to kill their pets, that you at least go out there and look them in the eye. Because I'm sure the woman I talked to on 5th West who was raped and had to flee and live on that island and couldn't get housing anywhere, that the man who set up a tent a few feet away from her, who had a drug problem he had gotten over and now had a job but still couldn't find housing. I'm sure that if they looked Mayor Mendenhall in the eye, she couldn't give them an answer either for why the police were raiding them and forcing them to move all of their belongings to just another place. Because until we have either a sanctioned campground or enough shelter beds, all you're going to do with an abatement policy is force people to move from place to place to place. That gives no solutions for residents who might not want encampments, and it gives no solutions, and it actively is a detriment to the entirety of the homeless population. It's the equivalent of taking human beings like you or I and shuttling them from place to place. And again, it's a horrific policy.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. It's happening in a place where people here are supposed to be considered more compassionate, more loving, caring. We take in tons of immigrants in Utah. Like we open our arms to immigrants. But I suppose if you fall on hard luck and then you find yourself on the streets, we don't care then anymore as far as our public policy makers go.
Absolutely. I'm not a Mormon church basher whatsoever generally, but that's an institution that has over $100 billion in liquid funds, and there are people freezing to death within blocks of their international headquarters. There is a clear moral divide here, and so much of our leadership has sided actively with the wrong side of that divide.
Yeah, and what I find interesting, the Mormon Church does give a lot of money in the Welfare Square program. You can go there, you can say you're going to hand out food to the homeless like Ty Bellamy does. They'll give you food to hand out. They also have, they're the largest owner of real estate for permanent supportive housing.
Absolutely.
They basically have contributed millions of dollars to shelter the homeless, which is the real estate arm of the permanent supportive housing that the Road Home operates. The Road Home and the VOA operate. But then these facilities are horrendous. I mean, you look at what's going on in these facilities, there's no wraparound services. These people are mentally ill, they are addicted to drugs, and they're not getting any of the compassion or community or support that they would need to get off drugs. And so you see neighborhoods like you described near the Magnolia that are just deteriorating. So what in your opinion needs to be done to sort of begin to solve the problem, not of just homelessness, but this addiction, mental health crisis we find ourselves in?
I mean, I think it all comes down to community. I think really with homelessness, the fundamental issue in large part is the amount of people who are dedicated to viewing the homeless as second-class citizens. And even if that's in, ostensibly positive, paternalistic way, it's still viewing people as being lesser than yourself. And as long as we as a society collectively agree that there is a class of people that are going to live on the streets, we cannot progress.
Yeah.
But regarding specific policies, again, working with local community organizations is very, very important. If you look at the Magnolia, that's one big issue. They just simply haven't done personal management there. I talked to a woman on 5th West who is in a supportive housing, or what's been claimed to be for supportive housing. Her plumbing was not working and her electricity went out. So yes, of course she was living on an encampment on the side of the street because it was an alternative between living in what's essentially an encampment inside and paying hundreds of dollars a month.
So in a permanent supportive housing unit, yes, her plumbing stopped working and her electricity went out.
So she was
and they
weren't
doing anything about it.
She was at a point where she had,
Did she say which unit, which building?
She did not specify which.
Huh. Wow.
But it's horrific that you're putting people in housing. And again, you can't expect people to pay for housing like that because that's no better than living on the street. Living in a studio apartment that's filled with feces because you don't have working plumbing and without working electricity. You can't expect people to live in and pay for that.
No, if that's I would take her word for it, but if that's accurate, that's awful. That if the whole building is like that, that would definitely be a big story.
It was specific to her unit, so she did specify that. But she mentioned having gone to management a number of occasions, and because she had a pet, also, it was just a whole issue, and they wouldn't work with her, and so she just decided that she would be better off to be on the street than to live in that place. So
do you believe permanent supportive housing is the solution? Housing first is what if that's not it?
I think it's a solution. I think homelessness has two very different categories of solution in the short term and the long term. So in the short term, it's working with churches, it's working with groups to ensure that everyone has food, it's ensuring that there's adequate shelter space by opening up places like the Ramada Inn or the old public safety building.
Mm-hmm.
Long term, it's things like a land value tax, split rate property taxation, or things that are going to make housing more affordable in a longer term. That could be zoning reform, that could be any number of policies. But again, those are two very different things, and it has to be a carrot and a stick solution where it comes to giving people resources and then also changing the system so there's housing affordability in the long term. Because one of the most interesting statistics, two big things. Firstly, most people who are in addiction or mental health issues on the streets, they develop those after landing in homelessness because of economic reasons. So you want to address that economic situation first and foremost. So in the long term, you're not having people who can't afford housing.
Yeah, exactly.
And I would say split rate property taxation to ensure that we have enough housing generally for our population growth is important.
Mm-hmm.
And then when it comes to homelessness generally, it's really fascinating. Would you guess what the state with the lowest rate of homelessness in the country is?
The lowest rate of homelessness in the country? Wyoming?
Mississippi. And would you guess what the country with the highest rate of poverty is?
The country or state?
The state, pardon me.
Mississippi.
Yep.
Yeah.
The poorest states have the lowest homelessness.
Wow, that's
because
surprising, yeah.
Things are still affordable.
Uh-huh. And also, I mean, I point this out with compassion with the people with addictions, but a lot of people who have addictions, nobody wants to rent to them.
No.
I mean, I'm a landlord. I could never rent to somebody who has an ongoing addiction problem with methamphetamines because you got to tear out all your drywall. You're looking at like at least just one unit, a $50,000 expense if they use that substance in your apartment. And so there has to be a place for these people who are still addicted. Where would you propose these people go?
Sanction camps, if again, there are models for infrastructure. There are what San Antonio did with their Haven for Hope, which is a sanctioned campground where no drugs are allowed in. People with addiction who are high are allowed in to get the resources they need, but you cannot bring your drugs with you. Mm-hmm. We've seen the failure of safe injection zones in place after place after place. But that doesn't mean the solution is a vindictive policy when it comes to drug addiction. It's a medically centered policy. It's a policy that's centered on removing addiction and on rehabilitating people like they do in Portugal, rather than just throwing them behind bars. But it is a policy that gives them solutions instead of just saying, you're free to do whatever you want. Because when it comes right down to it, as much as that is a policy that one might be sympathetic to, there is a public health issue with rampant drug use, and it's stopping those people's lives. Because when it comes right down to it, you're not making the decision, the drugs are.
Yeah. And do you agree with that? If there were a sanction camp, a place for people to go, to enforce a no drug policy in say one camp might be one thing, but to say that there's no drug policy, but then also no public camping, I mean, can you reconcile those two ideas?
Absolutely. I think you just have to put it in a place where you can't camp publicly. I guess you can't camp, I should say, in a city area. You know, when I slept on the side of the street in I-80, but that was not in a residential area. It was not by homes. I think you just can't allow people to camp on the side of the street in the middle of downtown or in the middle of Sugar House or Liberty Park, mm-hmm. because those are public spaces that can be used by everyone, and courts have found this. As long as there's no alternative housing, people have a right to camp there. But if there is an alternative, that is still a public space that is used by everyone, and you can't let a single group of people monopolize it. That being said, people have no choice, people who are unsheltered have no choice but to monopolize that public area until the government, whose job it is to protect the public welfare, is able to provide them the resources they deserve as human beings. It is a human rights violation to not provide adequate housing and to not provide adequate public toilets and things of the like. Yeah.
And I come at this problem as sort of a libertarian. Mm-hmm. Like the government should be, their job is to provide public safety and provide, protection against foreign enemies, all that sort of thing. But I never thought it should be the government's job to provide housing, because then having the government manage that just could be absolutely rife with corruption.
Absolutely.
But I think the government should provide absolutely adequate shelter and warmth. I think that is a public need, and that is something where your best alternative should never be to go commit a crime so you can go to jail to save your life from freezing to death. That just doesn't make any sense. So do you agree with that?
Absolutely.
That it shouldn't be the Magnolia place if you're a drug addict, but a campsite where you can just have a place to keep your stuff secure, so you can stay warm. I think absolutely.
All else aside, the city has no need to build housing right now because there are countless developers who want to do it anyways. What we need to do is provide a blueprint and a system with guardrails to make sure that there's an adequate supply of housing being built, which we can do adequately through reforming zoning policy,
Yeah,
and then also
reforming zoning policy could absolutely solve the
number
problem.
one thing. Just allow people to build and meet the market's needs, because the market can solve this. There are market demands. There is a supply. And there's a demand of people who need housing, and there is a supply that we don't have. And we can meet that supply. Again, the policy I'm absolutely enthusiastic about is, alongside zoning reform, is split rate property taxation. So instead of taxing people by the value of their house, you tax them by the value of just their land lot, which it helps everyone. For folks in downtown, it means they have a financial incentive to develop more and provide more housing that we need. And for folks in the East Bench and in some of the suburban areas, it lowers their taxes. It's a win-win situation for everyone.
But would they not then get enough tax revenue if they just did it by land lot? I mean,
again, split rate, but you can, because you can also raise revenue. You can raise the tax rate while focusing on land revenue, and you're disproportionately going to be affecting folks who are either owning multiple units or companies that own lots in
so it would
urban areas.
encourage developers to build up.
It would encourage developers to build up, and it would also, again, affect those city centers. So even if it's a higher rate overall, if it's primarily on land rather than developed housing and whatnot property.
What do you think about like the tiny home village conditional use permit? I think if every city along the Wasatch Front, if the state government mandated this, for example, that every single county, every single city along the Wasatch Front needs to have a conditional use zoning allowance for a sanctioned home, a sanctioned campground, as well as a tiny home village, we could also solve our affordable housing crisis through the market overnight.
Oh, I absolutely agree with you. I would take it a step further than tiny homes and focus on things like, a commonly owned complex or something. I think the issue with tiny homes is that because they're all rent focused, to be quite clear.
Yeah, and I would say tiny homes / pads for people to either park their RV or their car if they're living out of their car.
That's good, yeah.
Just something like that. Just a place where you're mandating as a state, okay, we need affordable housing. Every single place, every single city along the Wasatch Front needs to set aside 5 acres total, and people are going to be allowed to camp there and or have a tiny home there or an RV pad or a car parking spot.
There's an area in southern Utah where folks are able to cooperatively and commonly own their land lot, so it's a general land lot, but they each personally and individually own the houses they build on that, and that's a very good model that brings prices down. And I think encouraging ownership is important, because when we see the statistic about people being a paycheck away from homelessness, that wouldn't be the case if less people were renting. And so we do want to focus on encouraging development that is going to make us have a higher percentage of ownership of owner-occupied units.
I agree with that too. We have 80% of our land locked in BLM land. Why not open up some of that land so people can own land again, and so land prices can come down? I think that's also a great idea. So, Shiv, how old are you? Do you mind?
I'm 17, so I'm in my last
You're
year of high school.
17?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
I didn't mention it in the article, but yeah, I'm in my last year of high school.
You're still a kid.
Yes.
Gosh,
I'm quite involved with it. So.
I'm sorry you were homeless, and it seems like you're a thinker and you consider these important issues. So where are you going to school right now?
I go to the Salt Lake Center for Science Education, so out in Rose Park.
Oh wow, that sounds like a good place.
It is nice, yeah. It's a smaller community.
Yeah. And so your family's doing better now. You live with your mother, and
yes.
And so you live in a public housing facility now?
Well, it's nonprofit housing. It's on the Third and First area. So I think it has a lot of public investment, but it's nonprofit, so it's in the same kind of model. And I think there are benefits to that. Mm-hmm. That being said, I don't think with the way the city is right now, it would make sense to prioritize public housing and development, because again, developers want to do it. What we need to focus on is lowering prices.
Yeah. Yeah, well, thanks so much for coming on. Really
Thank you.
appreciate it. All right. Yeah, and if you want to be a bigger part of the program, of course, leave your comments below. We always love to have your comments, and we love sparking debate about these important issues because we strongly believe the answers are available. The voices of local Utah present those answers, and so that's what you're supporting by supporting Utah Stories. You can go out to our website and subscribe to our free digital newsletter, or if you'd like to contribute to our coverage, consider one of our different subscription membership options. You can get the free, you can get the subscription to Utah Stories for $3 a month, or become a member of Utah Stories, where you can get access to our exclusive digital content, like our panel discussion about homelessness that was done about a month ago at Brewvies Cinema Pub. And you can be a supporter also and get tickets to our upcoming events. So with that, thank you so much for watching. We will see you next time.